So in terms of how to structure your room, for music rooms, we try as best as possible to use as little electronic delay as possible. So we're going to try and position the speakers in an equidistant mode. Clearly at Capitol, that's not the case. Here we have a ceiling truss that is about 8 feet tall, where there is ceiling height to go higher. When we designed the system and when the system was implemented, it was with a number of other considerations in mind. This room is 22 feet by 18 feet wide. It's about 10 feet tall at the highest point and 6.5 feet at the back of the room, 7 feet at the back of the room. The speakers in the cavity are about 8 feet up. We found that that actually works pretty well. And so while it's not the optimum design necessarily, it's something that we found translatable. In our best practices documentation, you'll also find some minimum guidelines as to the minimum Dolby Atmos room dimensions that you should be using. Those are represented in both feet and meters, and so it's easier translation. I have a method when I walk into a mixed room for consultation. As I mentioned, I'm about 6'2". I'm shaped a bit like a Neumann head. Basic rule of thumb is if I can touch the ceiling, that's a good ceiling height. If it's more, that's great. If it's less, then we're starting to get into trouble. So if you think about Ceri standing up and stretching up, that's about the ceiling height that we should be looking at. If you can get to an equidistant layout, that just means we're going to put less delay, less timing constraints, and potentially mess with the phase and phase response of your system. A number of the manufacturers on the market will help to get to a position where you can control that relationship. With hundreds of millisecond delays in some of the monitor calibration systems, and also things like the Trinov that utilize their linear phase relationships for room optimization. There are a number of methods to solve for some of the discrepancies, but it's best to think about those room design plans early on so you can use the lesser electronic manipulation of your signals. As I mentioned, there is a target curve for Dolby Atmos music. That's a translation curve. That's really designed to help you to get to a position where you understand what the room characteristics of an optimized Atmos music space are. So what are some of the best practices for working in Dolby Atmos? I mentioned that a well-calibrated room is probably the first starting point. We do recommend sticking within a speaker brand for all of your speakers, if possible. Now, where that's not possible, we can work around some certain tonal differences. But if you're working within the same speaker brand, generally the speaker manufacturer has tried to match as close as possible the timbre quality across their ranges. They're certainly the engineering behind them, the way that the gain structure is made up, the way that the crossover is constructed. All of these things come into consistent playback. While you can work around with these factors electronically, it's often not optimal. So the more you can create a consistent sound field in your space with the physical aspects, with good treatment, with equidistant layouts, and various other things, the less we're going to need to electronically disturb that signal. Because we don't want to have a situation where we're overly compensating for physical characteristics of the room, because that is going to have a negative impact on what is created in that space. And so we do recommend that we try to keep the brands consistent, if not the speaker models. In terms of monitor controls and how the system comes together, while there is an attenuator in the Dolby Atmos renderer, I tend to not recommend that as a standalone solution. If something goes wrong with the system, the computer system freezes, it crashes, there's noise distortion, there's feedback. It's nice to have a physical control that you can just mute and protect your investment in those speakers. That's why we tend not to recommend it. So if what you have is the Dolby Atmos renderer and that's all that's available, then the attenuator can get you a certain distance down the pathway to success in creating Dolby Atmos mixes without needing to have a monitor controller. The more you can control externally, the better for the system, for your speakers, and for the ergonomics of the system. Having a physical knob to turn down. Here we have a touch panel control that deals with the B-chain calibration. And that B-chain is anything that happens after that renderer. So what's going into the amplifiers, the EQs, the speaker outputs themselves. That's all the B chain. And you'll hear that referenced quite a bit when you start working with Dolby Atmos. So the A chain is everything in your system before it gets to the renderer, and then the B chain is everything that comes after it. Dolby Atmos, having been in market for nearly a decade at this point, has spawned an awful lot of output devices, routers, monitor controls, and various other things that exist in the marketplace. From manufacturers such as DAD, the Avid Matrix, the MADI interfaces from RME, Dante interfaces from Focusrite, and then also the traditional audio interfaces for music, UADs, and various other things, are all able to be utilized for Dolby Atmos. How they get utilized might be a factor of design. So we have guidance on our website about how these things can interact. The basic rule of thumb is that you want to be able to have at least an audio interface that's capable of reaching all of your speakers, plus some headphones. If you're working in a 7.1.4 environment, that means your audio interface should have at least 12 channels, and then also the availability of headphone outputs. Companies like Focusrite have developed their ecosystem with things like the Red 16 line and the Red 8 Pre to work alongside of their R1 interface. That's a single ecosystem that can come together to use a monitor control and some audio output to the speakers. Avid, with their Matrix Studio unit, also have implemented a lot of that functionality. The Grace Design M908, there's a bunch of monitor controllers on the market and more coming online every single day. So reach out to your preferred manufacturer. Chances are they have implemented Dolby Atmos in some method and in some way, and can help you along the lines to get you to where you need to be.